The young bank millionaire thought it was just a contract marriage until the bride removed her veil and softly called his name. Hello everyone, before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It is quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support truly means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now let us return to our main character. The rain poured over the glass walls of the Blake & Co. Bank tower, lightning flashing across the skyline like veins of light. It was almost midnight when Ethan Blake, the 32-year-old CEO of the most powerful investment bank in New York, stood alone in his corner office. His white shirt sleeves were rolled up, his tie undone, and the soft blue glow of a dozen monitors reflected in his eyes. A storm was raging outside and another one inside his company. Federal investigators were circling his bank, searching for evidence of a billion-dollar laundering network hidden deep within their system. Ethan had spent years building his empire clean, but someone inside had turned it into a weapon. Now the countdown to his arrest had begun. Behind him, the elevator chimed. The glass doors opened and Lila Hart, a young internal auditor, stepped out. Her rain-soaked trench coat clung to her shoulders. She held a manila folder tight against her chest, the final report that could expose everything. Her voice trembled but stayed firm. Mr. Blake, I found something you need to see. Transfers from the Aurora accounts, hundreds of them. If I send this to the board, the bureau will be here within hours. Ethan turned slowly, eyes unreadable. And when they come, they will think you are part of it, he said. Those accounts are linked to your login. They will destroy you first. Lila froze. I did not move that money. I only traced it. I know, Ethan said, quietly stepping closer. But they do not. And whoever is behind this already knows your name. He placed a small black folder on the table in front of her. Inside were two papers, a marriage license and a non-disclosure agreement, both signed by him. Marry me tonight, Lila. It is the only way to keep you protected under spousal privilege. They cannot subpoena a wife. Her mouth parted in disbelief. You cannot be serious. A marriage. To you, think of it as a contract, he replied. 6 months. After that, you walk away with your life and your reputation. But if you file that report tonight, you will not live to testify. For a moment, only the sound of thunder filled the room. The rain traced slow rivers down the glass behind them. Lila's pulse pounded in her ears as she looked at the pen lying beside the papers. Her instinct told her to run, but another voice whispered that maybe, just maybe, Ethan Blake was not trying to silence her. Maybe he was trying to save her. Why me? She asked finally. Ethan's jaw tightened. Because you are the only one I can trust. You have no price, no agenda, and no blood on your hands. He slid the pen across the table. Sign it and I can keep you safe. Lila stared at his signature already printed in blue ink. The rain outside hit harder like applause from the dark. Her hand trembled as she reached for the pen. Do you promise this will end after 6 months? She whispered. Ethan looked at her, something raw flickering behind his controlled expression. It will end, he said softly, but not the way either of us expects. The clock struck midnight, the lightning flashed again, and with one stroke of ink, Lila Hart became Mrs. Ethan Blake in the marriage built not on love, but on secrets, too dangerous to survive. The morning after the storm, the city seemed calmer, but inside the tower of Blake & Co., tension had not faded. The rain had left the streets glistening, and the skyline reflected like silver glass. On the top floor, Ethan sat behind his desk, his wedding ring catching the pale light. The ink on their midnight marriage papers had barely dried. Across the room, Lila stood silently still, trying to understand what she had done. Her hair was pulled back in a loose braid, her clothes simple but clean, a contrast to the polished world surrounding her. She had signed her name to a contract she did not fully believe in, one that tied her to a man she barely knew for reasons she could not yet see. Ethan broke the silence. You cannot go back to your apartment, he said. The bureau has already issued a surveillance order. Someone is watching every move you make. Lila turned toward him. You mean because of your bank? Because of the people using my bank, he corrected, his voice steady but heavy. They will not stop at freezing accounts. They will come for anyone who threatens their network. You are safer here. Her eyes moved across the penthouse office. Security cameras were discreetly hidden in the corners, red lights blinking faintly. The glass walls showed the city below, but she felt trapped, not protected. I am not a hostage, she said, her tone firm. Ethan looked up at her, a trace of weariness in his eyes. You are not. You are my wife now, at least on paper. That means I protect you as one. The word wife caught her off guard. It sounded wrong on his tongue, too official, too empty. She stepped closer to the desk. You said this was about protection, not control. I want to keep working, and I want access to the audit files. If I am going to be your alibi, I need to know what I am covering for. Ethan studied her for a long moment. His silence filled the room like a low hum. Finally, he pressed a key on his computer, and the monitors behind him came to life. Dozens of accounts, transfers, and encrypted ledgers scrolling by. This is what you found, he said. But what you did not know is that half of these accounts belong to shell corporations run by someone inside our own board. Who, she asked. Robert Hale, Ethan replied. My father's closest partner. He built this bank with my family. He is also the one who has been bleeding it dry for years. I have been gathering proof. That is why I needed you. Me, she repeated. You were the only one whose audit trail they could not manipulate. Your report is the final piece. Lila looked at the screens, watching numbers and transactions blur together. It was larger than she imagined, money moving through fake charities, international accounts, political donations. Her breath caught. This could ruin everything. That is the point, he said quietly. If we expose it, the bank falls. If we hide it, we become them. She turned to face him, fully meeting his gaze. And which side are you on, Ethan? For the first time, his composure slipped. The side that survives long enough to make it right. The air between them felt charged, like the pause before lightning strikes. Ethan stepped away from the desk and handed her a small silver key. This opens the private elevator to the penthouse above. There is a security room there. Stay out of sight for the next 48 hours. I will handle the press and the board meeting. Lila hesitated, then took the key. What happens after 48 hours? Ethan's answer was a whisper. Either we clear our names or they bury both of us. She held his gaze for a moment longer, then turned toward the glass doors. The city outside gleamed under the morning sun, but it felt colder than the storm the night before. When the doors closed behind her, Ethan leaned back in his chair and stared at the ring on his hand. It was a symbol born from necessity, but already it felt heavier than any deal he had ever made. In another part of the city, a black sedan rolled through the rain-washed streets. Inside, Robert Hale read a short encrypted message. Blake married the auditor. Move the assets. Tonight. He smiled faintly, unaware that the woman he dismissed as harmless would soon be the one to destroy him. 2 days passed, and the air inside the Blake penthouse had grown heavy with silence. Lila barely slept. Every sound, the low hum of the elevator, the soft click of security cameras kept her alert. She spent the nights pacing between the window and the computer terminals. Ethan had allowed her to access reading through coded ledgers and encrypted reports. The more she read, the clearer it became. The rot in Blake and Co. ran deeper than she imagined. Ethan returned just before dawn on the third day. His suit jacket was damp from fog, his eyes shadowed from sleepless hours. He poured himself black coffee and sat opposite her at the marble counter. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Finally, Lila broke the silence. You said 48 hours. I have been patient. Tell me what is next. Ethan looked up. Next would make this marriage real. She stiffened. Real, on paper, he clarified. The board meets today. They already know about us. They need to believe this is more than protection. They need to believe it is love. Lila's expression hardened. So you want me to lie again? I want you to survive, he said quietly. If they suspect we are only pretending, they will dig until they find something to use against you, against both of us. He slid a thin folder toward her. Inside were printed guidelines appearances they would attend to gather statements for the press, and one line at the bottom that made her stop. Clause 5. No emotional involvement. She looked up at him. You actually wrote that down. Ethan's jaw tightened. This is still a contract, Lila. It keeps boundaries clear. Boundaries, she repeated. We are living in the same building, sleeping under the same roof, pretending to be husband and wife in front of the world. And you think there are boundaries left? For a moment, Ethan did not answer. His silence said more than his words ever could. Finally, he stood and walked toward the tall glass doors that opened to the terrace. I built my life on boundaries, he said, his voice low. Without them, I would have lost everything years ago. Lila closed the folder. Maybe that is why you have nothing real now. The words hung in the air like a blade. Ethan turned slowly, his expression unreadable, then walked away without another word. Later that morning, the press conference began in the atrium of the bank's headquarters. Reporters filled the room, cameras flashing, microphones poised. Ethan stood at the podium, his posture perfect, his voice calm, as he introduced Lila to the crowd. Today, he said, I am proud to present my wife, Mrs. Lila Blake. The audience erupted with questions. When did you meet? Was this sudden marriage a publicity stunt? Is it true she worked for your audit department? Ethan smiled faintly, keeping his composure. Love does not always follow schedules or headlines. Sometimes it happens when you least expect it. Lila stepped forward, her heart racing. For a moment, the cameras blinded her. Then she remembered his warning, make them believe. She reached for his hand, fingers trembling, and smiled up at him. It was not about power, she said into the microphone. It was about trust, the kind of trust that cannot be bought. The flashbulbs exploded again, the perfect illusion captured for every headline. Yet, as she looked at Ethan, she could not tell if he was acting or if something real had begun to surface behind his careful mask. That night, back in the penthouse, the silence returned. Ethan poured himself another coffee while Lila stared at the skyline. The marriage they had built for safety was starting to feel like a cage, and neither of them knew who was holding the key. Down in the streets below, another storm was forming. Robert Hale watched the news footage from the back of his car, a bitter smile curling on his lips. If Blake wants a war, he said to the driver, we will give him one. Outside, thunder rolled across the city once more. Inside the tower, two people bound by contract began to realize that paper signatures could not contain what was now growing between them. The following week unfolded like a performance they had both rehearsed but never believed in. Every morning, black cars waited outside the penthouse to take them to meetings, charity events, and interviews. Every evening, their photographs appeared across finance magazines and social feeds, the perfect power couple. In public, Ethan and Lila smiled, stood close, and played their roles flawlessly. In private, they lived in silence, separated by glass walls and secrets. Yet, the more they pretended, the harder it became to draw the line between what was real and what was not. Lila spent her days studying reports and tracing data Ethan provided from the bank's internal servers. Her natural precision impressed the small circle of loyal staff Ethan still trusted. Slowly, she began to understand the scope of the operation. Robert Hale had built hidden subsidiaries, offshore accounts, and political payoffs that could topple entire markets if exposed. One afternoon, as she worked in the study, Ethan appeared at the doorway, tie loosened, sleeves rolled up. You have been at this for hours, he said. Take a break. I cannot, she replied, without looking up. The numbers are changing. Someone is moving the funds again. He walked closer, watching the monitor over her shoulder. Streams of code and account movements flickered across the screen. They are cleaning their trail, Ethan murmured. Robert knows we are close. Lila turned to him. Then why are you still here? Why not call the bureau now? Because we do not have enough, he said. If I make a move too early, they will bury the evidence, and us along with it. Her voice dropped to a whisper. And what happens to me if you fail? Ethan met her eyes. Then I fail with you. The words hit her harder than she expected. For a moment, she saw not the ruthless CEO the world feared, but a man fighting to keep something good alive in a world built on greed. That night, Ethan took her to a private charity gala at the Metropolitan Hotel. The ballroom glittered with chandeliers and whispers. Lila wore a black silk gown, elegant but simple, her hair pinned low. She stood beside him as photographers snapped pictures, her smile steady despite the knots in her stomach. As the speeches ended, Ethan was called to the stage to address the donors. Lila watched from their table, sipping her water, trying to calm her nerves. That was when she overheard two men at the next table speaking in hushed tones. Transfer complete, one whispered. Aurora account cleared. Hale will be in Zurich by sunrise. Her pulse spiked. She turned slightly, catching sight of the speaker, a man she recognized from the bank's security division. Acting on instinct, she slid her phone under the table and tapped the record button. Just as she was about to capture another line, a familiar hand covered hers. Ethan. His grip was firm but calm, his voice low near her ear. Do not, he whispered. Not here. She looked up at him, startled. They are talking about Hale. I know, he said softly. But every camera in this room is watching us. Smile, Mrs. Blake. Lila forced a smile as he led her onto the dance floor. The orchestra played a slow waltz, the chandelier spinning gold above them. Ethan's hand rested at her waist, steady, controlled, but his eyes told a different story, one of worry, exhaustion, and something else she could not yet name. You knew they would be here, she said quietly. I needed confirmation, he replied. Now we have it. And the act, she asked. All this pretending, what is it really for? He looked at her for a long moment, then said, to protect you until I can end this. When the song ended, applause filled the room, cameras flashed again, and the illusion of perfection continued. But inside, Lila's heart raced with fear and confusion. Later, as their car pulled away from the hotel, she stared out the window at the city lights. Ethan, she said softly, how long can we keep lying? His answer came after a long pause. Until the truth is strong enough to save us. Neither of them spoke again. Outside New York glowed with the quiet beauty of midnight. Inside the car, two strangers bound by contracts sat side by side, no longer sure which part of their marriage was the lie and which part had already become real. The next morning, sunlight crept through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse, spilling across the marble floor. Lila sat at the long dining table, untouched breakfast in front of her, reading the morning headlines. Every newspaper carried the same photo. Ethan and her dancing at the gala, eyes locked, smiles perfect. The Blakes, Wall Street's fairy tale couple. She set the paper down. The truth behind that photograph felt like a cruel joke. Across the room, Ethan was already dressed for work. Dark suit, sharp phone pressed to his ear as he spoke in a low tone. When he noticed her watching, he ended the call and approached. They loved us, he said, a faint smile crossing his face. Every outlet is running that story. It buys us time. Lila folded her arms. Time for what? Ethan, another party, another lie. He sighed, the mask of control slipping just a little. Time to finish what I started. Phale is moving the last of the money overseas tonight. If I can trace the final transfer, we will have enough proof to destroy him. Her eyes narrowed. And what happens to me if this goes wrong again? He looked at her, then really looked as if the question pierced through the layers of strategy and control. You will not face them alone. Not this time. Before she could answer, the elevator chimed. Ethan's assistant, a nervous young man, rushed in holding a tablet. Sir, there's a problem. The Bureau's compliance team just arrived downstairs. They have a warrant to seize the servers. Ethan's expression hardened. They are early, he muttered. He turned to Lila. Stay here. Do not open the door for anyone. She stood. Ethan, wait. You cannot face them alone. I have to, he said already, walking toward the elevator. If Phale planted evidence in the system, they will find it. I need to control what they see. The elevator doors closed, leaving her in silence. Lila's hands trembled. Something inside her told her this was a trap. She crossed to the desk where Ethan kept the backup drive and began copying the files. She had been analyzing the ones showing Phale's offshore accounts. The progress bar moved slowly every second, echoing louder in the quiet room. Then, a sharp knock sounded at the door. Mrs. Blake, a male voice called, Federal Bureau of Investigation, we need to ask you some questions. Her heart raced. She hesitated, glancing at the computer. The transfer was at 93%. One more minute, she whispered. Ma'am, open the door now. The voice grew firmer. She looked toward the hallway. Through the security feed, she saw two men in dark suits outside. Something about them felt wrong. Their badges looked off, and one of them kept glancing toward the camera. Her instinct screamed. She grabbed the drive, unplugged it, and slipped it into her coat pocket. Moving quickly, she took the private elevator Ethan had shown her days ago and pressed for the security floor above. When the doors opened, the room was dimly lit by monitors showing every corner of the tower. She saw Ethan in the lobby below, surrounded by real agents, dozens of them. They were not there to arrest Phale. They were there for him. Her breath caught. No, she whispered. This is wrong. On the screen, Ethan was calm as agents cuffed his wrist. His eyes lifted to the security camera as if he somehow knew she was watching. Their gazes met through the lens, silent but heavy. He mouthed two words. Trust me. Tears stung her eyes. Before she could think, the elevator behind her opened again. Heavy footsteps approached. Lila turned ready to run, but it was too late. Robert Phale stepped into the room. He looked perfectly composed in his tailored suit, the charm of an old friend masking the cruelty in his smile. My dear Mrs. Blake, he said, voice smooth as glass. You really should not involve yourself in men's business. She froze. You set him up. He tilted his head. Ethan always thought he could outsmart me. But every empire needs a fall guy. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small flash drive, holding it between his fingers. This contains every transaction tying him to the Aurora accounts. When the Bureau finishes their work, your husband will be yesterday's scandal. Lila's heart pounded. You are lying. am I? Hale smiled coldly. In an hour he will be in federal custody and I will be in Zurich. You could come with me, you know. You are intelligent, brave. There is a place for you beside me if you play smart. Her voice shook but stayed firm. You underestimated the wrong woman. She turned toward the control panel and hit the emergency broadcast key Ethan had installed. Every screen in the building began recording. Hale's smirk faltered. What are you doing? He demanded. Finishing what Ethan started, she said. For the first time, fear flashed across his face. You will regret this. Lila stepped closer, holding his gaze. No, Robert. You will. The alarms began to wail through the tower as agents rushed toward the security floor. Hale backed away, realizing too late that the woman he had dismissed as decoration was now the only person who could destroy him. And down below, Ethan Blake, still in handcuffs, looked toward the ceiling as if he could hear the sirens echoing above. Knowing that his wife had just made her first move in the war, neither of them could walk away from the alarms echo through the glass tower like sirens from a war zone. Red lights flashed across the hallways, and the air smelled faintly of ozone and panic. Lila stood frozen in the security room, her pulse racing as agents stormed the floor. Robert Hale had vanished down the emergency stairwell, his expensive shoes leaving a trail of wet footprints on the tile. Her hands shook as she backed toward the console. The recording system was still active, saving every word Hale had said. Ethan's backup protocol had worked exactly as he designed. With trembling fingers, she removed the master drive and slipped it into the inner pocket of her coat. The elevator dinged behind her and she turned sharply. Two real federal agents stepped out, guns drawn. Mrs. Blake stepped away from the controls, one shouted. Lila raised her hands. Please, I can explain. The man you want is Robert Hale. He planted the evidence against my husband. It is all here on the system. The agents exchanged uncertain glances. You need to come with us, one said cautiously. Your husband is already in custody. I am not leaving without him, she said, her voice breaking. He was trying to stop them, not help them. Downstairs in the lobby, Ethan sat in the back of a black bureau vehicle, wrist still cuffed. Through the tinted glass, he saw the reflection of flashing lights above. For a moment, he feared the worst. Then, faintly, he heard the building's alarm code change from red to blue. A signal. Lila had found the evidence. A slow, grim smile touched his lips. She did it, he whispered. At that same moment inside the tower, chaos erupted. Agents surrounded Lila, questioning her, but one senior officer, a woman named Special Agent Daniels, stepped forward. You said you had proof, Lila nodded, holding up the drive. Everything is here. Transfer signatures, Hale's confession. He admitted it all while your cameras were recording. Daniels took the drive carefully. If this is real, Mrs. Blake, you just saved a lot more than your husband. Lila exhaled shakily, tears welling in her eyes. Then let me see him. Minutes later, she was escorted out of the building under the protection of agents. The city outside had turned gray with rain again. She climbed into a bureau vehicle, heart pounding, as they drove toward the federal holding facility where Ethan was being processed. When she entered the dimly lit interrogation room, Ethan lifted his head. He looked tired but unbroken, his hair disheveled, his white shirt stained from hours in custody. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Lila crossed the room and set the drive on the table between them. It is over, she said softly. I got him on record, Hale confessed. Ethan blinked in disbelief. You recorded him. I used your system. The broadcast key. She smiled faintly through her tears. You planned for everything, Ethan. You just did not plan for me. A faint laugh escaped him, the first real sound of relief he had made in days. You were never part of the plan, he said quietly. You were the only thing I could not calculate. Before she could reply, Agent Daniels entered with a small team holding a signed document. Mr. Blake, the charges are being dropped. The Bureau confirmed Mrs. Blake's evidence. Hale is being taken into custody at JFK right now. He did not make it to Zurich. Ethan let out a deep breath, the weight finally leaving his shoulders. Thank you, Agent. Daniels nodded. You two have caused quite a storm, but without you, half the financial sector would have gone under. She turned to Lila. You have done good work, Mrs. Blake. After the agents left, silence filled the room again. Lila sat opposite Ethan, watching him. The tension that once defined every moment between them had faded, replaced by something fragile but undeniable. What happens now? She asked quietly. Ethan leaned back in his chair, looking at her with an expression that was part admiration, part disbelief. Now, he said, now we deal with the truth. Lila frowned. What truth? He smiled faintly. That somewhere between all the lies and the contracts, I stopped pretending. The words settled between them like the calm after a storm. Outside, the first rays of morning light cut through the clouds, turning the wet streets gold. For the first time in weeks, there was no pretense, no cameras, no signatures, just two people who had risked everything for justice and found something deeper in the wreckage. Lila reached across the table, her fingers brushing against his. "Then let us start over," she whispered. Ethan looked at her hand for a long moment before entwining his fingers with hers. "No contracts this time," he said, softly. She smiled through her tears. "No contracts. Just the truth." And somewhere across the city, the sirens faded into silence, leaving behind nothing but the steady rhythm of rain falling softly over a story that had finally found its peace. A week later, the city moved on as if nothing had happened. The headlines that once shouted Ethan Blake's downfall now praised his redemption. Whistleblower wife exposes banking conspiracy. Blake and Co. cleared of corruption. The chaos that had nearly destroyed them was already fading into background noise. But for Ethan and Lila, peace felt foreign. They stayed in a small townhouse in the quieter part of Manhattan, far from the skyscrapers and boardrooms that had ruled their lives. The bureau had returned Ethan's passport, but the bank was under new management. For the first time in years, he had no schedule, no meetings, no empire to run. One morning, Lila found him standing by the window, coffee in hand, staring at the rain. "You do not have to keep watching the weather," she said gently. "The storm is gone." He smiled faintly. "The storms I am used to do not end with thunder, Lila. They end with silence." She joined him by the window. "You lost the bank," she said softly, "but you saved everything else." He turned to her. "Everything else? You have your name, your freedom," she said. Then, after a pause, "And me?" For a moment, Ethan said nothing. Then he set his cup down and took her hands. "When I asked you to marry me that night, I did it to protect you. It was never supposed to mean anything. I know," she said, her voice calm but warm, "but it did." Ethan laughed softly, a sound that felt strange after so much tension. "Do you realize what that means? That we broke every clause in our contract," she teased. "That he said and that I owe you more than any promise I could ever write." They stood in silence, watching the city below. The streets were still wet, reflecting the morning light. Lila rested her head against his shoulder. For the first time, there was no fear, no cameras, no lies, only quiet. Later that afternoon, Agent Daniels visited to finalize the last of the reports. As she stood at the door, she smiled at the couple. "You two make quite a team," she said. "I hope this marriage of convenience has turned into something real." Lila met Ethan's eyes and smiled. "It already has." When the door closed behind the agent, Ethan slipped an arm around Lila's waist. "You realize," he murmured, "that our marriage license is still valid." She looked up at him with a soft smile. "Then maybe it is time to stop pretending it is temporary." Outside, the rain finally stopped. The sky opened to a pale, hopeful blue, and the city exhaled. For the first time, the Blakes could breathe too free from the contract that had once bound them and bound now by something far stronger. 3 months later, the world finally stopped talking about them. The news cycle had shifted, the articles were buried under new scandals, and the cameras that once followed every step of Ethan and Lila Blake had disappeared. For the first time, they could simply live. They moved into a modest brownstone near Central Park, a quiet place with creaking wooden floors and sunlight that pooled through lace curtains. Lila began teaching again at a small community college, helping students who dreamed of working in finance but wanted to do it the right way. Ethan kept a low profile, spending his days consulting for nonprofit organizations that rebuilt trust in the banking system he once ruled. But even in peace, the past was not easily forgotten. One evening, Ethan returned home late, a thin folder in his hand. He found Lila in the kitchen rolling up her sleeves as she washed dishes. She smiled when she saw him. "You are late again." "Trouble." He placed the folder on the counter and shook his head. "Not trouble, opportunity." She dried her hands. "What kind of opportunity?" He opened the folder, revealing plans for a new foundation, the Heart Initiative. A program for financial transparency. Scholarships for auditors, grants for investigative journalism, everything we wish had existed before all this began. Lila's eyes softened. "You want to use our story to build something better?" He nodded. "It is time we turn the worst thing that ever happened to us into the reason someone else never has to go through it." She reached for his hand. "You do realize that makes you the first banker in New York to talk about honesty like it is a business plan." Ethan smiled, a quiet kind of smile that came from healing, not pride. Maybe it is. Maybe this time it is one worth investing in. They stood there for a long moment, the sound of rain outside soft and steady. The same rain that once symbolized chaos now felt like peace. Later that night, they walked together through Central Park, the air cool, the trees whispering above them. Ethan stopped near the bridge where street musicians play softly. He turned to her and said, "You know the contract we signed is still sitting in the vault somewhere." Lila laughed. "Let it stay there. It belongs to the past." Ethan reached into his coat pocket and pulled out something small, a velvet box. He opened it slowly, revealing a new ring, simple but shiny. "This one," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "is not a contract." Tears filled her eyes as he slipped it onto her finger. "Then what is it?" she asked. He smiled. "A promise. One built on truth." As they embraced under the city lights, the distant hum of traffic faded, replaced by the quiet certainty that this time their story was no longer about survival. It was about beginning again. 1 year later, spring returned to New York. The air was warmer, the city louder, and the park near their home was filled with new blossoms. The world had moved forward, and so had Ethan and Lila Blake. Their story, once front-page news, had become a quiet legend, whispered in business schools and ethics seminars. A story about courage, truth, and a marriage that began as a contract but ended as something real. On a bright morning in April, Lila stood before a group of young students in the new auditorium of the Heart Initiative, the foundation she and Ethan had built from nothing. Behind her, the words "Integrity builds trust" were carved into the marble wall. She spoke about accountability, transparency, and the power of doing what is right, even when it costs everything. Her voice was calm but filled with conviction. When the lecture ended, she stepped outside. Ethan was waiting under the old oak tree, wearing a light gray suit and holding 2 cups of coffee. "You were brilliant," he said, handing her one. "You make honesty sound like poetry." Lila smiled, shaking her head. "You are biased." "I am your husband," he said with a grin. "It is part of the job." They walked together through the courtyard, filled with blooming tulips. Every corner of the building reminded them of what they had survived. The trials, the betrayals, the night of rain and fear that had once started it all. Now it stood as proof that pain could be turned into purpose. Ethan stopped near the entrance and looked up at the engraved logo. "Do you ever think about that night?" he asked quietly. "Every time it rains," she said softly, "but not with fear anymore. It reminds me that we made it through." He reached into his pocket and took out the same old ring from their first contract, the one that had once symbolized duty and deception. He turned it in his hand before offering it to her. "I kept it," he said. "It reminds me that even false beginnings can lead to something true." Lila's eyes glistened as she placed her hand over his. "Then let us keep it as it is. Not a memory of what went wrong, but of what we learned." Ethan nodded. "A reminder that love built on truth never needs a contract." The wind moved gently through the courtyard, scattering petals across the stone steps. Somewhere nearby, church bells rang noon, bright and distant. As they walked back toward the foundation door side by side, Lila looked up at him and smiled. "It started as a deal," she said, "and became everything Ethan finished." Their laughter echoed softly through the halls of the building that now bore both their names. A lasting testament that even the most unlikely beginnings could lead to redemption, and that love, once chosen freely, could outlive every storm.